Hello, and thank you everyone for joining this session at Cloud Slam 11, Identifying and Removing Obstacles to Cloud Computing. My name is Penelope Gordon, and I'm a co-founder of OnePlug Corporation, a company offering cloud services to businesses in the Western United States. And my co-presenter, Mark Skelton from Capgemini, will also be presenting a portion of this presentation. As we go along, welcome questions. If possible, please enter the questions into the Q&A window, and we will answer them as we go along as possible. And then we welcome more interaction with the questions at the end of the presentation. We are leaving a little bit of time at the end for some questions and answers. You'd like to add to that?
That's fine. It's as Penelope was saying, that the process of obstacles and adoption and the incentives is something that we want to talk about, specifically about cloud computing. So we'll get on to that. Back to you, Penelope.
Thank you. So the takeaways for this presentation is really what we're focusing on is not just identifying and removing the obstacles to cloud adoption, but more specifically to enabling successful cloud adoption. So that may mean, in some cases, actually preventing people from making inappropriate decisions to buy cloud services. And the context then in which we're going to look at that is within the service lifecycle. So that's our framework, and I'll talk about that in a moment, about the service lifecycle. And within that, then, we'll talk about the factors influencing cloud adoption, the primary actors in each of the 4 phases of the service lifecycle, and then the incentives for motivating compliance with governance to remove the obstacles to successful adoption. We'll also talk about methods for mitigating the risk of making suboptimal adoption decisions, and then the methods for tracking cloud adoption progress. So how good a job you're doing at making those adoption decisions, and then continually improving your decision-making process and to improve the whole portfolio of services, cloud and otherwise, that you have. So the service life cycle, and this is something that we developed as part of our activities within the Open Group, the Cloud Work Group of the Open Group. And this is to provide a view of service life cycle for cloud services. We also call it the buying life cycle. And to look at that within the context of governance throughout all 4 phases of the buying life cycle. And so within this presentation, we're going to take the buyer's perspective of this as opposed to the provider's perspective. And so these are incentives for a buyer who's going to be consuming cloud computing services. So we have determine fit, establish requirements, negotiate, and manage performance. So determine fit is what you might think of as the assessment phase, where you're determining if cloud services are going to be a good fit for your business situation. Establish requirements is what you might think of as the plan and design phase. Negotiate is the implementation phase, and then manage performance would be the operational phase, the run phase. And as I said, this is all operating within the context of governances throughout. So just from a visual standpoint, that's depicted as a mesh that is throughout the life cycle. Then in terms of the obstacles, so we're going to look at that, and it is a cycle. So it's not just obstacles during the initial acquisition phase, but rather throughout the whole life cycle of these services. So during the managed performance and the established requirements and determined fit, as well as the actual negotiation and signing of a contract for services. Whether those services are internally provided or externally provided, that this is meant to be a view regardless of what type of cloud services you're providing. I'll also mention too that as we're looking at this, we do provide some little scenarios as we talk about incentives to comply with governance, but this is really intended to apply cross-industry and to SMBs as well as to larger companies. Although, so all companies are going to see some aspect of these obstacles that we're discussing. I would say that this is particularly applicable when we're talking about companies that have established governance or they're looking to really expand out their governance and to have some rigor to how they're making decisions. That what we're talking about here, you can identify with having obstacles and understanding what some of those obstacles are that you may need to address in order to successfully adopt cloud, but that if you don't have a governance process in place and you aren't looking to establish that, then that part of our presentation may not be as applicable. So in taking a look at obstacles, as I mentioned, that in terms of talking about successful cloud adoption, that it can also be the lack of obstacles. And this is one thing that is in particular when we look at cloud, that public cloud services can be very easy to buy. And so what we've seen a lot of is instances where you have a line of business executive that makes a decision to procure a cloud service, like, for example, a software as a service solution, and completely bypasses the IT department as part of that decision process. And so that can actually be then an important obstacle to successful adoption. So then looking again at the life cycle, here we just show a view where we have the primary actors and key influencers by phase. And so this is just trying to give you a feel for who is the person in each of these phases that we're really targeting with the obstacles and the incentives, and understanding those behaviors and how those behaviors can be shaped to improve the adoption of cloud services. So within the determine fit phase, we have line of business executives, directors, process and project owners. And really what they're looking at is this where you have the strategic planning. This is where you're doing a lot of the more the portfolio management, innovation management, really looking at how do we bring in emerging technologies into our portfolio of our IT enablement portfolio. So that's at that phase where you have the primary actor, the primary buyer is at that level. So we move into established requirements. Typically you would have someone to be a business architect, may have the title of enterprise architect, certainly influenced by not only the IT side of the business, but also by finance. Maybe the users have a lot of control over the nature of the services that are going to be procured. And so they're all providing input into the business architect and establishing the requirements. And this is establishing it from a business context, establishing the business context, and also the business requirements for the solution that they're looking to procure. Negotiate. You have the procurement officer. I mean, again, there could be other job titles, but that's the primary actor. And then we have under managed performance a vendor manager. And as I mentioned, that when we talk about vendors, that managing the providers, that may be an internal provider, and that may be somebody within the IT department who is looking to manage that interaction with the actual delivery team within the IT department. So moving on to slide 6, we have determine fit. So in these next 4 slides, what I'm going to do is to talk about the obstacles and influencing factors within each of the 4 phases of the service life cycle. So as I said, the determine fit is where you're determining if the buyer's objectives and the seller's capabilities align. And so the obstacles in this phase, primary obstacle is that the buyer is not incented to go through a standard governance process, to go through that decision-making process, and then they just bypass that and jump immediately to procuring the service. So that certainly is a major obstacle to successful adoption. Then, as well, then the buyer may, in determining fit, another obstacle is a mismatch between the nature of the business situation and the reality of its position within the company. So when we talk about a differentiating process, the differentiating process is the company's special sauce. And by nature, very oftentimes you talk to a process owner, a line of business executive, and they'll think that their particular business situation is critical or important, that they have particular unique requirements that they need to address. And the reason that this is a major obstacle to cloud adoption is because as the business process owner, if I feel that I have unique requirements, then it's going to be very difficult for those requirements to be met at any substantive level by a cloud service. A cloud service is looking at one-to-many, not looking at providing unique requirements. And so I'm greatly limiting the kind of cloud solution that I can procure if I am stating that I have unique requirements. And if it's not a differentiating process, then it's probably hard to justify those unique requirements, that I would probably be much better served if I were willing to go through some sort of step-by-step process to look at how I can switch from having unique requirements to having more standard requirements that can be more readily met with a cloud service. Another obstacle may be that while I recognize that my business process is not differentiating, but that the business process, the situation I'm looking at enabling with a cloud service is sharing resources with a process within the company that is differentiating. And so I'm unable to readily decouple that, and again, that's an obstacle. And it could just simply be that there's other projects within the company that have priority. Certainly a very important influencing factor is attitudes towards cloud within the company. In some companies, there's a lot of interest in investing in riskier projects and taking a certain portion of the investment dollars and continually to bring in emerging technology, new business models. But if it's an environment where that's not part of the culture, then it can maybe be very difficult to make the business case to adopt cloud computing until it is a much more established set of services. And that as well ties into the buyer's risk profile. Some other important influencing factors can be standards and certifications, being able to align cloud services with the business requirements is an important factor there. And as well, just the business case approval process has a large influence over the determining of the fitness of cloud solutions. So next phase in the life cycle, establish requirements. So this is, as I mentioned, laying the groundwork for getting the solution that is really going to address all the business situation needs. So this is the context and the business requirements. So obstacles here may be that there's a business culture that's not supportive of doing portfolio management. It's not supportive of going through a decision-making process that is delving in and looking at what are the relative priorities of this business situation versus another business situation. It could be that when you're looking at the business architecture, that only the peak functional requirements are considered, and that you have no variability in that. And so looking at a cloud solution where you're trying to take advantage of scalability, elasticity of resources, it may be difficult then from a requirement standpoint to align that and to justify going to a cloud solution. There may be policy restrictions on sharing of resources, and that could also be policy restrictions that relate to sharing certain kinds of information and the placement of information geographically. There may also be restrictions on configuration change control. When does the service need to be available? When do I need to be able to enhance the process definition? When do I need to be able to then enhance the underlying application and the underlying infrastructure? The next obstacle is that the buyers, what the buyer is looking for in a solution may not be well defined. A lot of people are turning to cloud computing with the idea that, oh, this is going to save me money. But it may actually be that the buyer's business requirements are more geared towards requiring a higher quality of service, at least during particular points in the service operation. And that may indeed be the primary value proposition that a cloud solution could provide as opposed to cheaper, but it will certainly be an obstacle to cloud adoption if there is not that understanding on the buyer's part as to what their requirements are actually, what value proposition their requirements are driving them towards. And again, on this quality of service point, quality of service and the emphasis on that is certainly a primary influencing factor. And when I talk about quality of service, I'm not just talking about a single aspect of QoS, such as availability, which is a typically understood aspect, but there's a whole set of quality of service aspects: reliability, accessibility, security, that are all, those are just some examples of what's included in the realm of quality of service. Certainly as well in establishing requirements is what are the transformation projects that the company has underway or that is looking at doing within the next couple of years, and what the basis is for funding approval is another major factor. Just switching for a moment, I believe that there was a question in the chat as to where the presentation can be downloaded. The presentation will be provided by CloudCore as part of the transcripts for the conference, and I'm sure we can discuss that more during the Q&A session at the end. The negotiate phase. So this is really establishing the terms and conditions. This may be in the form of a contract. It may also be simply, if it's particularly if it's an internal negotiation between the IT department and the line of business executive representative, that it isn't necessarily then a formal contract, but there is some sort of understanding of expectations and the terms and conditions that are surrounding the particular cloud service that it would be provided. So one of the major obstacles in this phase is that the buyer has switching costs that may appear to be insurmountable, and the switching costs are not related just to the new service, but that they may also be costs as listed here. Some examples, such as there's an existing IT enablement that may be expensive to unwind that and transition over to the new service. Another obstacle is provider immaturity. Particularly, this is an issue, I would say, with some of the newer forms of cloud services and the public cloud services in the market today, that there is a different level of particularly quality of service, the service level agreements that are part of the contracts that just don't exist in the contracts, and that a number of buyers, when they come to the table, they're used to dealing with outsourcers, and they're thinking in a mode that says these kinds of contract terms, they don't realize that they need to have those explicitly included, and so that's just part of that negotiation process, is to make sure that what has been implicit in discussions with more mature providers, that needs to be made explicit when you're dealing with a provider that has less experience on the contract side. There's also an obstacle where if you're talking about providers that are commodity providers that are really looking to provide a value proposition that is low cost, and by enabling that value proposition through achieving high volumes, that at that point the provider is very much in a mode of, if here's the contract, here's the pricing, here's the billing, and if you don't like it, then you can go find some other service. Another obstacle is that the particular set of business requirements that you're looking at may be such that you are part of a market that is really not of interest to potential cloud providers. That there's not the perception there is that there's not enough volume and not enough commonality of requirements to enable the one-to-many that's necessary to be providing a cloud service. Influencing factors in this phase are the compliance requirements from an industry and regulatory standpoint. So for example, it may be that if you're in the European Union, there is a regulatory requirement that employee data needs to reside within the European Union. And so that says if you're using a cloud service, that you would have to make sure that the employee data was not being stored outside of the European Union. Another influencing factor is community relations, and that in particular can have an effect where if you're looking at public cloud services, that if those are considered to be a form of outsourcing, that there are certain resistances from a community standpoint to various types of outsourcing when it involves offshoring. And then the fourth phase within the life cycle is looking at the results of your cloud decisions, and in part that's looking at the performance of the service itself, but it's also more importantly than looking at the performance of the service in the context of the decision that you made to procure that service and how that matches your expectations then. So an obstacle at this level is, again, provider immaturity. So if your provider is not providing you information on the performance of the service, and that's left to you as buyer and the consumer to collect that kind of information, it may be difficult to get a complete perspective of the performance of the service. There may be incompatibilities that further inhibit the collection of data about that, as well as incompatibilities within the tools that you're using within the corporation to measure business performance. And so your portfolio management tools, your BPM dashboards, that may be an obstacle there in terms of being able to measure and assess the decisions that you've made for cloud services. Budgeting and decision-making timelines may further be an inhibitor there in terms of this is really looking at extending the implementation phase, and so if you have particular expectations that I'm going to really realize the returns on investment that I made in switching from some sort of custom dedicated service to a cloud service, that it may take some time to realize that return. And if the budgeting and decision-making timeline that you have is incompatible with that, it may be an obstacle then to cloud adoption, because you're not going to be able to realize the results that were expected. And it may also just simply be that within the culture that there's not support for taking the time and going back and assessing previous decisions and feeding that information back into the determine fit phase to be able to improve on your decisions, to be able to continually improve your portfolio of IT enablement services. Certainly influencing factors would be competitors, cloud adoption, and the experiences that they've had, the lessons learned, the input that is received from the providers, both your current providers as well as providers of alternative services, and then just simply advances in the technology is a factor here. And this is really intended, again, to be a life cycle, so managed performance isn't the last step, but rather feeding into determined fit. So as there's technology improvements, it may be that you see that, okay, we went with just just as an example, we went with just a basic level of infrastructure, cloud service, but now there's some new technology that's enabling us to more effectively transition off of a dedicated custom application and business process definition to environment now where we can just move to a SaaS or BPaaS kind of solution, because some of our concerns around quality of service, such as security, have been addressed with some technology advancements. Now we shift from looking at the obstacles and identifying the obstacles at the different phases within the service life cycle. Now we're going to move to talking about governance, and for governance and the incentives for governance compliance, I'm going to turn this part of the presentation over to my collaborator, Mark Skilton, to address this section. Mark?
Thank you, Penelope. Hi, everybody. As we've heard, there's a number of areas of adoption that need to be considered in the life cycle of cloud computing. Just to remind ourselves again, cloud computing really is an introduction of a industrialized service into your organization. So if you're in a federal organization or a telecommunications organization or a government organization or a dynamic marketplace, which we see in telco or pharmaceutical or media industries particularly, what we're seeing here is the need, to understand how we can maximize the value from cloud computing. This is really what the point of this presentation is. So this section, as Penelope has said, is what are the incentives? What can we do to try and encourage our own departments and people to actually use cloud adoption successfully, to use the cloud services? And as a provider or managing providers, what does providers need to do to try and encourage people to actually build the volume of business that will make them profitable to deliver the sort of user experience that we want to get out of cloud computing? So really the two things that I want you to think about, and when you're looking at pull criteria or pull incentives or push incentives, the simple way I would describe this is think of this as a checklist of the metrics, policies and business criteria. The metrics of the policies and business criteria that you need to put in place for the consumers, your own business people, your own IT people in your own organization, which could be spread out in many countries, could be operating across many business boundaries, both geographic and time zone. What do we need to do to put in terms of pull incentives to actually manage the provision of those services effectively? What incentives, what sort of governance policy procedures do we need? Likewise, with push incentives, what sort of things can we incentivize people, the actual users, the tenants, if you want to call that, the tenants, the users, to actually consume this service, this cloud service, more effectively, and to get the benefits that they're seeking. Clearly, as said there, if compliance is spotty, that's quite an English phrase. What we're saying there is that the idea here that I've seen a number of case studies in my own experience, and I'm just talking about my own experiences here really in general, is that often what we can do in one business unit may not necessarily translate to another business unit if we're trying to get a one-to-many or shared service through the cloud. Whether you're a large organization or you're a small organization, a self-employed single operator, these principles of incentives are valid in both cases, both public and private cloud. So we move on to the next slide. What we're seeing here is that because what we've done is broken the life cycle, the industrial life cycle of consuming the cloud into 4 phases. The first phase is really the strategic phase, or the identification phase. As a consumer of the cloud, what sort of strategic fit, what sort of a fit does cloud have with your organization? And we just picked an example. It could be any example for cloud services. We picked one for contact management. Contact management is effectively a sales automation tool, software product that we're very familiar with, all of us, in our organizations. Well, that typically is an area that could be using SaaS, software as a service, in the cloud. And what we're talking about in this case is what sort of incentives can we put in place for the buyer to actually buy a SaaS service that is going to meet their business needs. How can we actually make that more successful, given that we've already assumed that they want to look at cloud, they want to look at software as a service, but what sort of incentives, what sort of metrics, what sort of business criteria should we be guiding these people to try and use? This could be, as I said, either a single operator or it could be a multi-billion-dollar organization. This is still valid in terms of thinking about the process quality, as I would use that phrase. So really the pull metrics, the pull being the sort of the vision of the service, what we need to be encouraging is really trying to get some clear business objectives, clear business criteria in place around how we're going to assess the cloud service. Now, the criteria could be about, typically they tend to be thinking around security and compliance standards for your industry. In the FDA, in the case of the federal food and drink sector, or in the government sector or federal sector, you could have government policy security controls requiring you to do certain things. Likewise, in terms of the business case, being able to get clear stakeholder engagement, because if this cloud service is meant to engage a number of communities in the consumption of this service, we have to be looking at ways in which we can engage the requirements of all of those people to determine if they meet all of the stakeholders, all of the users of the cloud going forward. Another simple aspect that we need to be thinking of also clearly is the data compliance. If you've got, in this case, contact management data, or it could be marketing data for marketing campaigns, or it could be transactional data to do with citizens or federal transactions that you need to keep securely in the cloud, you need to be thinking about what is the compatibility, what is the standards around that area at this stage of the life cycle of determining which type of cloud solution will fit for you. So what we're looking for there is policies around requirements management, we would recommend in PAW, policies around and decision criteria being put into projects and processes in your organization. If you're in a large utility organization or a large energy company, those sorts of things you would look for in terms of governance and policies to do cloud adoption. Next thing is that we have the need for push processes. Pushing is really what sort of things can we do for the consumer of the cloud service, looking at ways in which we can incentivize people to actually consume the cloud service. What sort of criteria can we reward people if they start to bring in other people or use the service consistently? What sort of things can we do in terms of at this stage of the determined fit cycle? Can we encourage selection procedures to be guided towards purchasing decisions, purchasing policies in your organization to purchase the right type of cloud solution? Moving on to the next slide. Next slide is really then talking about the requirements management process. And in this example case study, we're simply talking about defining the contact management requirements. We talk about the public cloud. This could equally be a private cloud or a combination of your own on-premise resources and services, combining that with another type of on-demand software as a service solution. What we're saying here then in terms of the incentives to try and get the requirements in shape for the sort of workloads, and this is stuff that Penelope and I have been focusing heavily on in the Open Group, for example, a standards body that we're both involved with, is trying to design procedures that will move forward in terms of getting the requirements specification down tightly enough and clearly enough so that we've got the clear workload requirement, the clear sort of consistency and security, the sort of non-functional requirements that will be pertinent to a software as a service solution. What we're finding is that certain checklists can be put in place in your organizations. We recommend you do put in a checklist process to try and give some guidance to projects and purchasing decision makers. Particularly, I see the business architect or the enterprise architect or that type of role, depending on your organization, taking a lead in doing this. Then from a push point of view, again, the push is really what can we do to get the consumers of the service moving towards adopting at the requirement stage, participating in the software as a service specification activity. We need to be looking at what sort of providers are providing knowledge and knowledge transfer and engaging for your type of industry. If you're in the telco industry or you're offering an application store, or if you're in a federal practice, what sort of standards and services does the provider have to incentivize the requirements process for those users to be using that service going forward? So it's very much, as I say to a lot of people about requirements, the big difference about cloud computing for me, moving away from SOA, service-oriented architecture, which is a given now, is almost non-differentiating. It's just an industrial process that is now everywhere in IT. What we're talking about with cloud is very much a clear view from the demand and supply planning, the demand and supply strategies, and putting forward policies and guidelines to get people to get the requirements to be aligning with the common requirements, the common demand, and the common supply solutions that you want to seek to push in your organization. Next slide. So moving on to the next slide, what we have here is then in the negotiation process, this for me is almost critical. It's something that I, in my day job, do very regularly in terms of understanding what is the risk-reward process for cloud adoption. This risk is really something that I think if I would say one thing that cloud has changed fundamentally is really the shifting of the risk has moved in using cloud. Either if you're a provider or a consumer, the risk is then shared or is moved to a third party, which is beyond just outsourcing, traditional outsourcing or outtasking. What you're doing here is the visibility of the service, the consumption of the service, the point of use of that service is fundamentally changing to a self-service portal, to a way in which the services have to be moved and optimized to meet certain business users or certain IT consumers. That process is kind of moved into a cloud environment, which may or may not be visible to you as a consumer. And so what we need to be doing is understanding what sort of risk issues are going on in the negotiation process. What's the risk to you as a consumer? What service levels do you need? And so from a provider, what sort of volume and legal obligations around the service levels? What sort of compliance do you need to be following? And these things, again, checklist items that I would recommend you put into your policy and negotiation process when you're finalizing the cloud solution. So from a pool solution point of view, you're talking it from the consumer, from the provider point of view. What sort of legal policies, what sort of mechanisms, and what sort of underwriting, if you will, do you have in place to ensure that if you auto-scale or you have to scale up or scale down your provision of the service, what sort of underwriting or what sort of capacity do you have as commitment for that particular service to a customer? Is that possible? Can you commit to that in terms of the service negotiation process? And then another side that we're seeing a lot of is in terms of extra contract negotiations that need to be worked in place. If, for example, the service fails or there's a lack of compliance with the SLA services that you've suggested in the requirements process. So what sort of legal obligations, what sort of penalties do you as a consumer or a provider need to negotiate at this stage so that both parties are able to understand the risk and the commitment that both need to be involved in for a cloud service? Again, if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, this level of negotiation may be different to a large-scale organization which has potentially many thousands of users or licenses in place in the cloud. But the principle is still the same. If the system goes down or the system is not compliant, or if you want to swap or change provider, what is the negotiation mechanisms you've got in place to do that? Likewise, with the push mechanism, again, you need to be looking at the incentives that you need to be negotiating with your consumers. Last year, an example I saw with a large academic institution was that there was a strong need to understand how the consumers in each of the academic institutions would actually participate in the cloud capacity, because each would be providing some capacity themselves from their own servers and their own compute resources into a shared cloud environment. And this kind of exchange of services was an incentive for people to say, well, I can get some remuneration back on my budget if I'm seen to be handing back my spare capacity to the cloud. Likewise, there was a capability to incentivize people to use the cloud, because the shared ownership of the catalog was something that was done on behalf by the IT department, but also shared as a shared catalog to all of the business units themselves. Next slide. Next slide. What we're doing here is moving on into the final slide, which is about performance management incentives. And performance management incentives is, again, the process in which once the cloud or software as a service or cloud solution is up and running, how do we incentivize the continual use of that service? How do we improve that portfolio of services? Because, again, as I said, cloud is partly an industrial process, introducing a business model of pay-as-you-go, on-demand, elastic performance, and a new business model is introduced into the organization, and maintaining the persistent use of that service is important both as a provider, so that you get return on investment of the commitment, or equally, if it is just a burst service, a short-term service, that is clearly understood by both parties and the service expectations are in place. So again, just to finish off on this slide before I hand back to Penelope, again, think about your policies and procedures and use this as a checklist. So in your pull mechanism, what sort of things can you do to look at your provider or provision of services? What can you do to incorporate cross-fertilization to other services in your ecosystem of your catalog? So if you're a telecoms provider or an outsourcing provider, so shall we say, or a large-scale IT department, you should be trying to encourage multiple use of other services within your cloud catalog. Likewise, in terms of the performance improvements, we're seeing a lot of price competition, particularly in the public cloud. How does this actually get leveraged so you get continuous innovation? Crowdsourcing are techniques that you can use, but also pricing and benchmarking. What can you do to start to look at ways in which you can renegotiate or maybe bring in other continuous improvement performance as we go through the life cycle of using the service? And finally, pushing the consumers. Again, look at ways in which you can incentivize people through maybe reports or reward systems, so that if you're using incentivizing people through using some kind of loyalty system or royalty system, you can use stars or some kind of account management process to incentivize people to be consuming the cloud service in a more productive way, so that there's a win-win scenario. So back to the final slide on 15 before I hand back to Penelope. On 15, what we're talking about there is really then having identified the process of looking at the sort of incentives, what sort of things can we do to then manage the risk, mitigate the risk, so that we can try and maximize the adoption process of the cloud in a continuous lifecycle way. So what we're doing there really is this process of really looking at mitigating the risk through the life cycle. It's not just one part of the process. One of the other key things, apart from risk transfer in the cloud, is that the risk or using the cloud is a life cycle consumption model. So you use things, you then consume things, you then move forward, and you develop services that are continually optimizing and improving the performance of the service And this is just a checklist of things that we can talk about in terms of incentivizing or managing the risk at each of these stages. So, identifying...
And Mark, let me jump in here too. Yeah. And so really what we're looking at here is not so much just mitigating, not to say that it isn't important, but not just mitigating the risk of cloud consumption, but rather mitigating the risk of suboptimal adoption decisions. So when you're looking at this from a portfolio perspective, it could be that going back to our example here with the contact management, if the line of business executive made a decision to buy a public cloud SaaS service to satisfy the contact management, that may be a decision that works for that line of business executive in that context, but when you look at it from an overall corporation perspective, that it may be a suboptimal decision because that opportunity then is lost to have that contact management resource consumption aggregated with some of the other requirements that the corporation has, and to be able to get some sort of larger cloud service then that is of benefit across a number of different areas of the company. And they may have that option unavailable to them if a micro-level decision was made in one part of the company. If you have a whole series of micro-level decisions, that may preclude a broader cloud solution that would be of greater benefit. And so this is part of what we're looking at here is throughout these different phases, what are some of the key ways of combating this tendency to make those micro-level decisions, or to, in general, as we've been talking about with incentivizing compliance with governance, how do you keep decisions being made that are not taking into account all the business requirements, are not taking into account the larger business context. And so just as a couple of examples here, picking off from this, is to be able to have within a lot of this is be using your governance to mitigate those risks. So we have that within the negotiate phase, then that if you have an understanding of what are the key service levels that I need to make sure that are met, that then you make sure that there's some incentives put in place that the provider will focus in on those particular service levels that are of most importance, and that's going to, and then to contract in a way that allows you to switch to an alternative service if the particular provider that you've contracted with proves to not have the level of performance that you were looking for. So Mark, is there anything else you wanted to add on mitigating risk?
No, I think that was a timely reminder to get back to the timeline of the presentation. Yes, I mean, it's ultimately about managing the risks of the cloud through the whole life cycle. So hopefully we've covered that. Back to you.
Okay, and then want to look as well at adoption tracking. And so as I have here in the green box, this is really what can I do to make sure that these decisions that are being made to adopt cloud services are being looked at throughout the life cycle. And so we've provided here some key targets and metrics that you can use to look at the adoption. So for example, we have time to progress decisions through each phase of the service life cycle. And so this is really looking at it from a portfolio management and pipeline management perspective, that as you start, if you take a look from the determined fit phase, that if you think about it, that the way a venture capitalist might manage a portfolio, that you want to have a number of potential cloud solutions coming in, then be able to move that quickly through your decision-making process. And that can be part of the metrics that you use. And coming back into the incentive then, that if people are incented to move those decisions in appropriate fashion through the process, then that will incent people to utilize all of the materials in your governance, assuming that your governance has good sound decision criteria and that it has the policies and other templates and artifacts already in place that will improve that process. So coming to the takeaways again, so we've talked about the framework for successful cloud adoption, the service lifecycle, and within that then the primary actors and the influencing factors and those actors making cloud adoption decisions, and how to incent those actors to comply with the governance process, to remove a lot of the obstacles to successful cloud adoption, how to mitigate the risk of making less than optimal cloud decisions, and how to track the progress of those decisions. And so with that, if there are any questions that you've saved up, I would welcome those before we conclude. Mark, did you see anything on the chat session that you wanted to address?
No, I don't think that anything specific had come up.
Okay.
No.
Well, and Mark and I both certainly welcome follow-on questions, and if you'd like to dialogue with us further, we've provided our email addresses and LinkedIn address there, and we welcome further dialogue. Thank you very much for attending our session. Again, that was identifying and removing the obstacles to cloud adoption.
Thank you.